Mr. Shelby, you may proceed with your opening statement.
Three weeks. 3 weeks. We are here today because between December 14th, 2018 and December 16th of 2018, this defendant, Shelby Nealy, murdered Richard Ivansic, Laura Ivansic, and Nicholas Ivansic so that he could avoid the consequences of his actions for what amounted to 3 more weeks. Thank you all for your time and attention thus far. I know it's been a long day, a long process, but opening statement is my opportunity to tell you what I expect the evidence to show. A summary of the story that is going to come, if you will. And the testimony and the evidence in this case is going to transport you outside of this courtroom and into the lives of, and the last days of Richard Ivansic, Laura Ivansic, and Nick Ivansic. The day before, or 2 days before, he was brutally murdered was Richard Ivansic's 71st birthday. You'll get to hear a little bit about Richard. He was an athlete in high school, married his high school sweetheart, and with her had 4 children. Richard, same name, Renee, Mike, and Mark. They lived in Ohio, and after a number of years, Richard and his first wife separated. Get to the mid-1980s, Richard would eventually meet and marry Laura Ivansic. Laura was 59 in December of 2018 when this defendant brutally murdered her. Laura and Richard had a passion for fostering children. Children who didn't have any other place to go, who needed love and care, if only for a little while. Nicholas and Jamie were the 2 children that, after fostering, they were able to adopt, not providing just a temporary refuge and temporary love and care. Instead, Richard and Laura were there to provide them with permanent love and care. Nicholas had been born in 1993, which means he was 25 years old when this defendant killed him. And Jamie had been born in 1997. So in Ohio, where all these people were living for a period of time, Nick, as he got older, teenage years, worked for a time at Burger King. And he becomes friends at Burger King with another employee there, this defendant. Through this friendship, the defendant meets Nick's sister, Jamie. They become romantic, the defendant and Jamie, and they marry. Early on in their relationship, which would have been roughly 2015 and 2016, they moved to South Florida, where Richard had moved, and lived with him for a time. But then they end up moving back to Ohio, where Laura had remained and was living because her mother was dying and she was staying to care for her mother. This defendant and Jamie have a child up in Ohio a little girl named Bella, who would have been roughly 3 in December of 2018, when the most relevant time period. So the defendant and Jamie live with Laura or other members of Laura's family for a little while up in Ohio. And then the defendant and Jamie end up moving back down to Florida and living again with Richard in Spring Hill, here close to here in Hernando County. Jamie and the defendant and their child live there for a time in Hernando. Laura's mother does pass, and she moves down to Florida to be with Richard. So roughly mid to late 2017, this defendant and Jamie rent a house at 10930 Norwood Avenue in Port Richey, which is in Pasco County. So now they and their child are living there alone, and Jamie has a second child, a little boy who will end up being approximately 1 year old in December of 2018. By mid to late February of 2018, the residence at 10930 Norwood Avenue is abandoned. Family is gone. Jamie's phone's having problems, but Laura and Richard and others still communicate with Jamie via texting or social media. Time passes. Laura and Richard, who had been close with Jamie, living with her, regular part of her life, they keep communicating with her, or trying to communicate with her, and trying to see their daughter. Jamie's family is in Ohio, and they're in Texas. Finally, Jamie and her family, which would be this defendant and the two kids, are going to come to Florida to visit. So by now, Richard and Laura have moved to 1954 Juanita Way, which would have been, they moved there sometime in mid-2018, which is in the Little Mobile Home Park in the northernmost part of Tarpon Springs, here in Pinellas County. It's a 55-plus community, but Nick stays with them for the most part too. He lives there as well. And he'd been living with Richard for some time in Florida during the point where Richard had moved down here. So now Jamie and her family are coming to visit 1954 Juanita Way early to mid-December of 2018. They'll be there for Richard's birthday, the holidays, but at some point between December 2nd and December of 2018 and December 7th, so 2nd and 7th of 2018, Jamie's gray Hyundai vehicle arrives with this defendant, the two kids, but no Jamie. This defendant explains to them how Jamie couldn't make it because of work. She had to stay in Texas. They were also ducking collections investigators because they had abandoned the Norwood Avenue residence. So Jamie remained in Texas and didn't come. So the defendant and his two kids, remember about three and about one, are staying with Richard, Laura, and Nick for at least a week, which brings us to December 14th of 2018. So we know on December 14th that Laura goes on a shopping trip. We know it takes her up to State Road 50 in Hernando County. She goes to a CVS, she goes to a Cracker Barrel, she goes to a bank, and then the last place that we know she goes is to a Walgreens on US 19 in Port Richey, which would be on the way back. And that's at 3:45 p.m. in her red 2013 Kia vehicle. So backing up just a bit, the day before, which would be December 13th of 2018, was Richard Ivansic's birthday. Richard, as I mentioned earlier, turned 71. And on that day, he spoke to people on the phone. In particular, his son, Richard, I'm going to call him Rich to distinguish, his son Rich. And that is the last time that anyone outside of the people staying at 1954 Juanita Way will hear from Richard. Because once you hear the evidence and put the pieces together, it will show that Laura goes on that shopping trip. And either during those hours shopping, as the evidence will suggest, or potentially, maybe on the 15th at a shopping, if she's shopping again, definitely no later than the 15th, that Nick is apparently not home as well, possibly working. So Richard is alone, 1954 Juanita Way, with this defendant and the two small children. And this defendant, all along, had been planning to murder everyone in that house. So while Richard is walking in the house, in the dining room area towards the kitchen, this defendant, armed with a hammer, attacks him. Richard gets hit twice in the chest. A third blow hits him in the neck. And then he is struck multiple times in the head. Richard lies there horribly injured for some period of time as the defendant realizes he's not dead, and then comes back and attacks him more, inflicting injuries that will ultimately result in Richard's death. Richard gets hit in the head at least 7 times that can be detected. Because multiple blows are hard to tell. If you're hitting somebody in the same place over and over again, you can't necessarily distinguish it as multiple blows. But there's at least 7 blows to the head. In the nose, in the forehead, in the right eye, in the back of the head. So the defendant leaves Richard there on the floor and waits. He waits for Laura to return so that he can bash Laura's skull in as well. So Laura, as I told you before, we know was at Walgreens in Port Richey at 3:45 p.m. on December 14th, which was a Friday. Given travel time, she's alive until at least 4 p.m. on the 14th. Give or take a few minutes. So she walks into her house, no idea that Richard is lying with his head bashed in, dying on the floor. And as she goes to enter the kitchen, the defendant begins bashing her head in with a hammer, striking her at least 5 times in the back of the head. So that leaves Nick. While Nick is away, the defendant begins to hide the evidence of his horrible crimes. Both Laura and Richard are apparently incapacitated on or very near to carpets lying on the floor in the respective rooms that they are in. So the defendant uses the carpet to roll up Laura, drag her down the hallway of this mobile home to the end door, which is the master bedroom, and into the connected master bathroom. He then rolls up Richard in the carpet, drags him down the hall into the master bedroom, and closes the door. He then mops up the floor to ensure that Nick will not suspect the violent fate that his parents have suffered and the violent fate that this defendant has in store for Nick himself. Nick will eventually return home. It is not entirely clear when, sometime between the late afternoon, early evening of December 14th, possibly sometime on December 15th. But remember, Nick was a friend, a good friend of the defendant. They were close. They are close. So the defendant wants to hang out with Nick one last time before he bashes his head in with a hammer. They get pizza. They hang out. They watch TV. They smoke. Nick even leaves to get more marijuana at some point and comes back. At some point, they watch The Grinch. This goes on. At some point between the early morning of December 15th and the early morning of December 16th, Nick is asleep on the couch in the living room, and this defendant is awake. So now it's time to finish what he traveled from Texas to do. The defendant gets the same hammer, comes up to Nick while he's sleeping, and begins bashing him in the head. Nick springs up and is not quick, like the defendant will later claim he wanted it to be, and there are multiple blows, bashing Nick's forehead in, causing the injuries that will ultimately lead to his death. At least 3, but in the estimate of this defendant, at least 5 to 7 blows. Nick is similarly dragged from the living room on some type of blanket from the couch into his bedroom and left unceremoniously on the floor just inside the door. About 2.5 weeks pass. Christmas comes and goes. Laura's brother-in-law passes away. Richard, Laura, and Nick aren't discovered dead and rotting at 1954 Juanita Way until New Year's Day of 2019. Multiple family members had tried to contact them between December 14th of 2018 and New Year's of 2019. But as they later found out, this defendant had been answering some texts on Laura's phone as part of his plan in order to throw everybody off, which we did successfully for a time. But on January 1st of 2019, Richard's oldest son, Rich, has been trying to reach his father and has not been able to. He compares notes with other family members, and he's concerned, so he calls law enforcement to do a welfare check so that the law enforcement here can have contact and make sure the people at 1954 Juanita Way are okay. The people were not okay. So Officer Rondos with Tarpon Springs Police Department responds along with other law enforcement officers. It doesn't take long to suspect that this is not the typical welfare check call they get, and that something far more sinister is going on. And it will take more than just a knock on the front door and making contact. So upon arrival, they get there. There's an obvious hole dug in the front yard. It looks like a grave. Dirt piled up on one side. Walking around the mobile home, there are flies visible on the windows, on the inside. And there's the smell. Law enforcement knocks on the door. No one answers. Front door is locked. But there's a sliding glass door that they're able to enter through a porch. And as they enter, it is more and more clear that this is going to be bad. There's a couch just inside the sliding glass door with blood all over it. And the place is just trashed. Garbage all over the floor in the kitchen. Moving into the living room from the kitchen, there's a drop cloth strangely laid out on the floor. And again, trash is lying around. So law enforcement, while announcing themselves, go deeper into the residence, into the hallway that all the bedrooms are off of. They check the first bedroom on the right. A little unkempt, but otherwise normal. Before even opening the next door on the right, they can see, which would be Nick's bedroom, they can see the fluid pooling at the bottom of the doorway. Open the door, and there's Nick, covered with a tarp. Also, paint poured on parts of him. The room is just a disaster. Paint spattered on the walls, egg on the walls, garbage just piled on the bed in the middle, trashed. Down to the next bedroom, the last room on the hall, the master bedroom. Door opens, and there's Richard, partially rolled up in a rug, covered in paint, as if someone had just poured some paint on him, onto his face. Beyond him, into the master bathroom, is Laura, kind of rolled up in a carpet, a red towel on top of her back, some paint poured on her, and the rooms are just ransacked, trashed. Paint flung around on the walls, stuff piled on the bed, just like in Nick's room, drawers emptied, completely trashed. And all three occupants long dead. So now the investigation begins. A search warrant is obtained to search the residence. Initially, at first check, the identities of the bodies were not obvious, especially Nick. And with the investigation, especially one of this magnitude, a lot begins to happen at once. medical examiner is going to have to come, collect the bodies to do the autopsies, figure out what it was that killed these people. The scene is going to have to be searched and processed for evidence to try and figure out what happened to these people, who may have done this to these people. Anyone who could have or could lead to information, law enforcement is going to try and seek out and speak to. So on the scene, various areas of blood spatter are found and documented. Interestingly, several areas of blood spatter on the walls have been painted over with white spray paint. But multiple receipts and similar items are found from the December 14th of 2018 and later. Domino's pizza boxes, McDonald's receipts, notably a receipt from GameStop dated December 16th, and a receipt from Home Depot dated December 18th. A white Krylon spray paint can is found in a box of trash on the porch. And in the washer of the laundry room is found a shirt with the Punisher logo on it, and some shorts that appear to have either paint splatter or some sort of chemical like bleach or something splatter on them. Fingerprints are attempted from all kinds of different objects, all kinds of different places within this residence. Ultimately, a hammer is located underneath the master bedroom bed. That hammer will eventually be tested for DNA, and it will match its last victim, Nick. This defendant's fingerprints end up being found all over the place. Jewelry box in the master bedroom, on that Krylon white spray paint can, on a package for masks. I say masks, I'm going to call them COVID masks. But remember, back in December 2018, nobody had heard of COVID. Nobody had even heard of a COVID mask. We all learned about that in 2020. But those things were still sold, still available, and there was a package for them with this defendant's fingerprint on it. There are also some things that should be there that were not. Most notably, Laura's red 2013 Kia vehicle is nowhere to be found. The only vehicle there is Richard's, a van belonging to Richard that was really Nick's, that Nick would use. Nick and Richard's IDs are not located. There's some personal items that are missing that are expected to be there. Richard was a coin collector. There's no, all the coin collection's gone. There's a revolver that should be there that's gone. Now, I told you multiple things are going on at the same time. One of the things that develops is that Jamie and this defendant are two people that law enforcement want to get in touch with, if for no other reason than for notification of what has happened and basic information. Eventually that shifts to wanting to locate the two of them and their kids because no one is sure exactly where they are or where they even should be. Later in the investigation, Jamie's gray Hyundai vehicle is located at the clubhouse parking lot of the mobile home park, which is roughly a couple hundred yards away from 1954 Juanita Way. The trunk is stuffed with multiple trash bags full of things that clearly came from 1954 Juanita Way. Paperwork that would have been in Richard and Laura's bedroom. Laura's and Jamie's passports. Some receipts indicating that the defendant had been in Texas until at least December 2nd of 2018. In the garbage bag, some receipts from Laura's probably last shopping trip on December 14th. There's a pillow saturated in blood. And also Laura's purse, which we know had gone on that December 14th shopping trip with her, and that also has blood on it. So a major focus swiftly becomes finding this defendant, finding Laura's red 2013 Kia vehicle. With the help of law enforcement in Ohio, on January 3rd, 2019, Laura's 2013 red Kia vehicle is discovered at 1573 Newman Avenue in Lakewood, Ohio. And one of the people staying at that address at that time was this defendant. So Detective Anderson and Detective Scarpati with Tarpon Springs Police Department travel to Ohio. The 2013 red Kia is eventually searched, and more receipts are found. Walmart, McDonald's, and more, spanning dates since December 16th of 2018. 1573 Newman Avenue is searched, and a wallet with Richard and Nick's driver's license is located. Also, their credit cards, Richard's coin collection is found, some other items of interest, and also notably a weight belt. Through all the receipts that are collected from the various places that they were found, detectives are able to see that on December 16th of 2018, this defendant went to Walmart in Palm Harbor wearing the shirt with that Punisher logo that was found in the washer, and he buys a bunch of scented things, scented things which were also found in the house. He goes to McDonald's that day, gets chicken nuggets at lunchtime. He goes and sells a bunch of Nick's video games wearing the same Punisher shirt at GameStop in Palm Harbor in the evening hours. And then he eats at dinner time at McDonald's, again, getting chicken McNuggets. On December 17th of 2018, in the evening, he's at McDonald's again getting chicken McNuggets. December 18th of 2018, the defendant spends the late morning hours going to Walmart in Port Richey, where he purchases that Krylon white spray paint, as well as the COVID masks. Also, some additional items to include clothes that he will later be seen in. He goes to McDonald's that day around lunchtime and gets, surprise, chicken nuggets. And then he goes to Home Depot in Port Richey. At Home Depot, he buys tarps, which are found in the residence. One of them laid out. One of them appears to be on Nick. He buys a paint can opener, which is found in the residence. And also on the Home Depot surveillance, you can observe that he is wearing blue shoes, and I'm going to call them unblemished blue shoes. On December 20th of 2018, he goes to Dunkin' Donuts and Holiday. On December 21st, 2018, around lunchtime, he gets chicken nuggets from McDonald's in Port Richey. He then goes to Walmart in Hudson, where notably those blue shoes that were unblemished a couple days earlier now can be seen with paint or bleach splotches on them, consistent with the paint and the chemicals that were poured on the bodies. The defendant orders Domino's Pizza that evening at 1954 Juanita Way, so that would be the 21st, where he is still staying. On December 22nd, he goes to the McDonald's in Port Richey in the evening. And then on December 23rd of 2018, he leaves 1954 Juanita Way for good. And he leaves, and we track him out of town. He stops at a McDonald's on State Route 54 in Pasco County in Newport Richey at about 2:30 p.m. And then we next pick him up in Macon, Georgia at a McDonald's in the evening hours on his way to Ohio. And every time we were able to see the defendant and see the vehicle that he is using at any of those locations, it is the defendant driving that 2013 red Kia vehicle. Laura's 2013 red Kia vehicle. And then sometime Christmas Eve or Christmas, the defendant is in Ohio until he is caught on January 3rd. Defendant has, detectives get different records, different communications the defendant makes, and they reveal some of his activities, what he was planning to do as all this is playing out. As I told you, Ohio authorities picked up the defendant and Detective Anderson and Detective Scarpati flew up to Ohio as quickly as they could. Detective Anderson ends up sitting down with this defendant, and the defendant confesses. Chillingly, heartlessly, methodically, he describes his version of what he did and to some degree why he did it. One thing he says, though, that no one knew yet, although some had been starting to suspect and likely would have been discovered soon after, is about Jamie. Remember the defendant's wife, Jamie Ivansic, who he lived with at 10930 Norwood Avenue in Port Richey, way back in January, February of 2018. Well, it turns out that Jamie never moved away from Norwood Avenue. The defendant had killed her. According to the defendant, during an argument that turned violent, Jamie had armed herself with a knife. The defendant had disarmed her and then strangled her. And while she was helpless, he bashed her head in with a hammer. At least 12 separate blows, caving in both sides of her head. The defendant had then left her body in the bathtub for a few days while he figured out what to do. In that residence, he had a fenced-in backyard, so some privacy. He dug a hole about 3 feet deep, put Jamie in trash bags, and buried her in that backyard. He then trashed that residence to distract from his crime, pouring paint or other liquids all around the bathroom where her body had been bleeding out, messed the place up, and he and his kids abandoned it. Fleeing first to Ohio and then later to Texas. And since then, the property manager had renovated the residence, rented it out again, and no one had yet thought to excavate the backyard looking for Jamie, who was, as of yet, no one had realized was missing. Because the defendant had then pretended to be Jamie on her phone, texting people, responding to texts, hiding the fact that Jamie was dead and buried in a backyard in Port Richey. It was a plan that was to some degree successful. That continued to be successful until January of 2019. But Jamie's parents had wanted to see her. They wanted to talk to her. They kept trying to communicate with her. And the defendant was afraid that his crime would be discovered. So he decided that he was going to travel from Texas to Tarpon Springs and kill them. He planned to kill them, to take their stuff, and to do the same thing with them that he had apparently succeeded with Jamie. So when he arrives at 1954 Juanita Way, without Jamie, it had nothing to do with Jamie having been at work or creditors trying to reach them. It was because she had been dead and buried for 10 months. He arrived to execute his plan that would help him avoid arrest and avoid the consequences of his actions. And execute it he did. I expect the evidence to show that days before starting his Tarpon Springs murder spree, he was planning on taking Laura's car and going back to Ohio. He waited until he could safely crush their skulls with a hammer, one at a time, when he's alone with Richard. I say alone because the two children were very small, but while he was alone with Richard on December 14th, latest December 15th, he bashes his head in. He describes how he had to go back over and finish the job because initially he thought Richard was dead, but turned out he wasn't. Defendant patiently waits for Laura to return and then bashes her head in with a hammer. He then moves their bodies to the master bathroom, cleans so that Nick won't realize that his parents are both dead in that trailer when he arrives. And of course, the defendant likes Nick. Nick's his friend. Doesn't like him enough not to violently murder him, but likes him enough to hang out with him for probably maybe the entirety of December 15th. And then when Nick is asleep, he swings the hammer at him. Again, Nick was jolted awake, and in the defendant's words, I think the defendant's words are jolted awake. But the defendant is unrelenting, continues to bash Nick's head in for another 6 or 7 times by his own count, until Nick is sufficiently incapacitated, and then he drags Nick's body into the bedroom. So then there's phase 2 of the plan. Remember, bashing Jamie's head in with a hammer and burying her in the yard, trashing the place, worked so well the last time. So the defendant begins the process of burying the bodies in the yard at 1954 Juanita Way, and of messing up the crime scene. In so doing, he moves the couches around. He moves the couch that Nick was killed on into a different room to block off the entryway. He goes out to buy that Krylon spray paint. He uses that to spray paint on the walls to try and hide the blood spatter. He gets the tarps from Home Depot, and he gets rope at Home Depot so that he can wrap the bodies up and drag them out to bury them in the yard. He pours paint and chemicals on the bodies to try to help with the smell. He starts digging the hole. But sometime around the afternoon of December 18th or on December 19th, he has to change the plan. He realizes that Richard is too heavy for him to get to the hole, and that he may not have the ability to get the 3 bodies from the house into the yard during the cover of night and into the hole that he has been digging. He still messes up the house, but now his plan changes to he's going to leave the bodies where they are. He's going to go back to Ohio. He's going to work out, exercise, bulk up. Remember that weight belt I told you about? And in the meantime, perhaps the bodies will get lighter as they decompose. And then the defendant will return sometime around February, complete the plan, and bury the bodies. He uses Laura's phone to send messages to her family members, just like he did with Jamie. So on December 23rd of 2018, when he leaves 1954 Juanita Way, leaves the decomposing bodies of Richard, Laura, and Nick en route to Ohio. He does so to enjoy the remainder of the 3 weeks that he had bought himself for the price of violently ending 3 lives. Now, that's not all the evidence that I expect you'll hear over the next few weeks. Over the course of the next few days, Mr. Doga and I will be presenting evidence to give the general circumstances of the crime, but also to prove 4 different aggravators with respect to each of the 3 murders. 1, that the defendant has been convicted of another capital felony or violent felony. And since the defendant sits before you, having already pled guilty, he has been convicted of manslaughter for killing Jamie, which satisfies that aggravator, and also for each other murder he's been convicted of. 2, that the defendant committed the offense to avoid arrest. That in murdering Richard, the defendant was trying to avoid the arrest for killing Jamie. That in murdering Laura, the defendant was trying to avoid arrest for killing Jamie and Richard. And that in killing Nick, he was trying to avoid arrest for killing Jamie, Laura, and Richard. 3, that the way the defendant committed each murder was cold, calculated, and premeditated, based on the plan he made and the manner in which he set out to destroy the remaining members of this family. And 4, that the murder of Richard and Nicholas was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. And then, the conclusion of the evidence, we will ask you to weigh those aggravating factors against any mitigation that may be presented, and then find that the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigation and that this defendant should be put to death by the state of Florida. Thank you.